Hello and welcome back to Bicycle Legs and another edition of Anniversary Albums. Today we're going to be looking at albums that are having a significant anniversary in the month of May 2024. For those of you who are new to this series, when I say a significant anniversary, I'm talking about one that ends in a 5 or a 0. So 45th, 50th, 25th, 30th, that sort of thing. You'll get the hang of it as we go along. As usual, I've picked 10 albums. Again, a lot to leave out when you're only picking 10, so please do let me know in the comments any that you think I should have included. But let's get started straight away, and we're looking at an album that is having its 50th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 1st of May 1974. It is one of my all-time favorite albums by one of my all-time favorite artists, and that is Kimono My House by Sparks. Now, I recently did a Sparks studio albums ranked. We picked our top 10, myself and Larry Graves from Canadian Stud Muffin. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Please do check that out. We both rated this album very, very highly in our top 10 Sparks albums. And why wouldn't you? I mean, this has the song that made them big stars in the UK, which is This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us. It's also got Amateur Hour, which was also a top 10 hit for them in the UK. But you've also got wonderful songs like Falling in Love with Myself Again. You've got Thank God It's Not Christmas, which is probably one of the first Sparks songs I was ever exposed to. You've got the wonderful Hastana Manana Monsieur, which I buggered up the pronunciation of when we did our Sparks show too. Talent is an Asset's a great song. Equator is a great way to finish the album. It really is the album that made Sparks big, especially in the UK and Europe. But they were never a long-term successful band. It's amazing that they've had as long a career as they have, considering they haven't had that many hits. They're a wonderful band. If you don't know Sparks, please go and have a look at our top 10 video. It's well worth a check out, and there's some great music for you to discover there. The next album we're having a look at is having its 35th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 2nd of May 1989. It is Disintegration by The Cure. This album is one of the most quintessentially Cure albums I think that they ever made. It's just got that really gothic feel to it. It's a wonderful, wonderful album. I mean, you've got wonderful songs like Pictures of You and Love Song and Lullaby. Oh, I remember the film clip for that. It's so creepy with the spiders and stuff. It's wonderful. But you've also got Close Down and Plain Song and Prayers of Rain, The Same Deep Water as You. The title track is wonderful. It's a great album, and it really is, if people sort of think in their heads what The Cure sound like, this album is, where you're going to go. It's a wonderful Cure album. It's one of my favorites. I was very honored to be able to participate in a book that Martin Popoff wrote about The Cure, going through it album by album, their career. I will leave a link in the description to that book. I highly recommend you buy it, not just because I'm in it, a bunch of wonderful people are in it, and we give lots of really in-depth sort of analysis into these wonderful Cure albums. It's a Martin Popoff book, so you know it's going to be great. The next album we're going to have a look at is having its 45th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 4th of May 1979, and that is Orchestral Favorit by Frank Zappa. Now, this was one of 3 albums that he was sort of contractually obligated to release on Reprise Records. He wanted to go to another record company and put this music out and slightly different forms and that sort of thing. But they're still great albums, those albums, and this is no exception. It's instrumental Frank for the most part, and I love instrumental Frank Zappa. It's some of my favourite stuff. Strictly Gentile is wonderful. Pedro's Dowry, Naval Aviation in... I love his titles. Naval Aviation in Art. I mean, I love the titles that he comes up with for his pieces. Duke of Prunes, another one, and Bogus Pomp. They're just really great, instrumental pieces. Frank Zappa, as always, he would write his own orchestrations. He was completely self-taught, which I just still think is incredible. Yeah, I love Frank Zappa. I love his instrumental stuff in particular. I've done a Frank Zappa top 10. I will leave a link to that in the description. From memory, this one didn't quite make my top 10, but there's so many Frank Zappa albums. I mean, they can't all be in your top 10 when he's got, I think he released 60 odd albums during his lifetime, and there's been countless more since. The next album we're going to have a look at is having its 55th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 14th of May 1969. It is the second solo album by this artist and the first with this particular backing band that he still works with to this day, and that is Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere by Neil Young and Crazy Horse. There's some absolute classic Neil Young on this album. This came out around the same time as another album that I'm going to be talking about in this video. And just, it really set up Neil Young's career in a lot of ways. I mean, you've got Cinnamon Girl and Cowgirl in the Sand, which are two, classic Neil Young songs to this day. But you've also got Down by the River. You've got the title track, Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. You've got Round and Round, It Won't Be Long. You've got The Losing End, and Running Dry, which, yeah. I mean, there's just every song on this album is wonderful. I really feel like I like the first Neil Young album quite a bit, but this to me is where he really sort of sets himself out, and you get an idea of what Neil Young's going to be all about. There's, the hard rock and Neil Young. There's the sort of country folk rock Neil Young. You've got the wonderful Crazy Horse, which, as I say, to this day, he's still working with, Billy Talbot, Ralph Molina. It's just incredible. So it's one of my favorite Neil Young albums. The next album we're going to have a look at is having its 40th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 14th of May 1984. It is the best-selling album by this artist, and that is Chicago 17. Now, I know a lot of people bag on Chicago, generally speaking, and even if they admit to liking Chicago, they really will only admit to liking the Terry Kath years. They're definitely not into the 80s Chicago with the power ballads and all that sort of thing. Todd Evans and I did a video in defense of Chicago in the 80s. I will leave a link to that in the description. I think Chicago made some wonderful music in the 80s, as does Todd. And we go on about that in that video. I think we speak for about an hour talking about Chicago's albums in the 80s. And, this album, it was huge. I think it's like 6 times platinum or something like that in the United States. And, it's got some big hits on it. Things like Hard Habit to Break and You're the Inspiration. But it's also got We Can Stop the Hurtin', which is a wonderful Robert Lamb song. Robert Lamb's my favorite member of Chicago. And, it's wonderful to hear him on lead vocals because he really wasn't there much on Chicago 16 at all. And it's a great song. It's, got a bit of funk to it. But you've also got Stay the Night, which was a decent sized hit for them. You've got Only You, which is a wonderful song. Which is got a bit of a sort of a soul vibe to it a little bit. Remember the Feeling is like the ballad that didn't get released as a single, and I think it should have been. It's a wonderful song. You've got Along Comes a Woman. You've got Prima Donna, which was on the soundtrack for the film Two of a Kind, which had Olivia Newton-John and John Travolta. I remember seeing that at the cinema. Not a great film, but it had a pretty good soundtrack. Once in a Lifetime, wonderful song. Not the Talking Heads song, obviously. It's a song written by James Pankow. It's a really, really good song, sung wonderfully by Bill Champlin. I really like this album. I'm unapologetically a fan of Chicago in the 80s as well as in the 70s. So I'll defend this music as I have in the video with Todd. I think it's a great album. The next album we're going to have a look at is the youngest album we're looking at this month. It's having its 15th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 18th of May 2009. It is an absolute latter-day renaissance for this band, and that is The Liberty of Norton Folgate by Madness. This came out 10 years after their previous album, Wonderful, which in turn came out something like 15 years before their last one, because they'd been broken up for a while. This album, though, is just a masterpiece. It's one of the best Madness albums. It mixes that original sort of ska feel they had with that sort of Kincksian music that they would do, that sort of social commentary and, you know, sort of life in London and that sort of thing. It's a great album, you know. There are numerous versions of this too, with different songs on them. But I mean, you know, the big songs on here, Dust Devil, Sugar and Spice, you know, We Are London, Bingo, you know, there's a lot of great songs on this album. But it really is one of those albums you need to take as a whole piece, I think. It's just a wonderful, it takes you on a journey. It's one of those albums that really does take you on a journey. And if you haven't listened to Madness since the 80s, this is a great place to start sort of exploring latter-day Madness. It's one of my favorite Madness albums from any era of their career. Now the next album we're going to have a look at is one that is often quite bagged on by the fans of this band. I love this album. It's having its 45th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 23rd of May 1979. And that is Dynasty, or Dynasty as the Americans like to call it, by Kiss. Now, this was sort of in the US, this was, I mean, even though I Was Made for Loving You was a big hit for them, commercially this album didn't do as well as some of the earlier ones, but here in Australia, this album made Kiss superstars. Just absolutely wonderful. I love this album. People call it their disco album. Really, I Was Made for Loving You to me is the only disco-y song on this album. I mean, Sure Know Something was another big hit here in Australia. Got a lot of radio play at the time. But you've also got songs like Charisma, you've got Magic Touch, you've got their wonderful version of 2000 Man by the Rolling Stones, sung wonderfully by Ace Frehley. You know, Save Your Love, Magic Touch, you've got Dirty Livin'. I really like this album. I like the late 70s, early 80s Kiss. People call it the pop Kiss, whatever. I like it. I love the earlier Kiss too, don't get me wrong. But Dynasty, you know, that's where I came in to Kiss. You know, I would have been, what, 8 years old when this album came out. And yeah, I thought it was great, and I still do. The next album we're going to have a look at is having its 50th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 24th of May 1974, and that is Diamond Dogs by David Bowie. Now, I've done a David Bowie top 10 albums, studio albums ranked. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Diamond Dogs didn't quite make my top 10, but again, you know, David Bowie has such a strong discography that some great albums had to be left out to make it only a top 10. And I only made it a top 10 because at the time, you know, I didn't want to make hour-long videos or whatever. I was making shorter videos at the time. I didn't have guests, that sort of thing. So maybe at some stage I will revisit David Bowie and do the entire catalogue. But this would be, you know, just outside my top 10. It's a wonderful, wonderful album. You know, it really is. It's, you know, side one has this real sort of feel as almost as if it runs as one track. You know, it starts off with Future Legend, which is really an intro into Diamond Dog's title track, which is great. Then you get Sweet Thing Candidate and Sweet Thing Reprise, which, again, you know, just all run together as one track. You have the wonderful Rebel Rebel, which is one of his best singles. Great glam rock track. This is coming out of the Ziggy Stardust period. He wasn't quite sure where he was going yet. He was starting to take a step towards that sort of soul man thing that he would do for Young Americans. You get hints of that. There's almost proto-disco on this too. I mean, songs like 1984 really sort of prefigure disco. You got the wonderful Rock and Roll With Me. You know, you've got Big Brother. You know, there's some. He wanted to do an entire album based on George Orwell's 1984, but he didn't get permission to do that. So he did a couple of songs that were based on that, and then the other ones made his sort of own dystopian kind of imagery and that sort of thing for the rest of the album. I think it's a great album. Bowie plays almost all the guitar on this album, and he's not, you know, he's a good guitar player, but he's not as finessed as a Mick Ronson or something like that. So the guitar on this album, you get a sort of jaggedy edge to it, which I really, really like. It's definitely a wonderful David Bowie album, but most of them are. They're really, I think he did 26 albums, 28 if you include the 2 Tin Machine albums. And maybe there's 1 or 2 albums in there that I'm not a huge fan of. The rest of them I love to bits. Oh, I missed one album, which I have on CD rather than vinyl, so I'll put it in now. It's having its 30th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 17th of May 1994, and that is Boingo by, well, they're called Boingo on this album, but we know them all as Oingo Boingo. Just last week I did a studio albums ranked on Oingo Boingo with the wonderful Steve Schnee. I will leave a link to that in the description as well. Please do check that out if you haven't already. I rated this album pretty highly. It is very different from anything else in the Oingo Boingo catalogue, as I sort of mentioned in the video, as Steve did as well. It's more cinematic, it's darker, it's menacing, it's, you know, you can definitely hear where Danny Elfman was going with his soundtrack work and would continue to go with his soundtrack work on this album. Just so many great songs on this album. You know, it starts off with Insanity, which is a frightening song, but I love it to bits. You know, it's got the wonderful Mary, which I think is just the most heartbreaking song Oingo Boingo ever did. You've got Can't See, Useless. You've got War Again, one of my favorite Oingo Boingo tracks. You've got the 16-minute long Change. You know, there's Lost Like This, which was an early Oingo Boingo song that they revisited. They had never officially released it, but they did record a version of it 10, 11 years earlier. There's so many good songs on this album. It's a long album. Until recently, it had never been released on vinyl. Thank you to Liam Hare, who I did a wonderful show with recently about Men at Work, for letting me know that it had been just last year released on vinyl for the very first time. So I'm going to be ordering a copy of that as soon as I can. But it's a great album, as I say, different from anything else in the Oingo Boingo catalogue, but definitely worth checking out in my humble opinion. The last album we're going to have a look at is having its 55th anniversary in the month of May. It was originally released on the 29th of May 1969. It is the debut album by this trio, who would sometimes also be a quartet, and that is the self-titled Crosby, Stills and Nash. You know, at the same time these three were putting out their debut album and starting off a whole thing, Neil Young, who would soon join them in Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, was doing the wonderful Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. Wonderful time for music, just absolutely wonderful. And this, you know, so many classics on here, you know, Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, love it. Marrakesh Express, one of their best singles. You could always count on Graham Nash to write those really great singles, I think. But you've also got the wonderful Guinevere, You Don't Have to Cry, Pre-Road Downs, the classic Wooden Ships, you know, which was, you know, co-written with members of Jefferson Airplane, Lady of the Island, Helplessly Hoping, Long Time Gone, 49 Bye-Byes. Every track on this album is wonderful. To me, they would go to even better things with Deja Vu, but this album is just absolutely brilliant top to bottom. Every song on here absolutely great, and those harmonies, my goodness, aren't they just absolutely wonderful? So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Those are my 10 anniversary albums for the month of May 2024. As I say, please let me know in the comments which of these albums you like, maybe which ones you don't care for so much, and most importantly, please let me know which ones you think I should have included that I left out, because there certainly are plenty. And sometimes, as I always say, you guys come up with albums that I didn't even think of, and I love you to bits for that. Please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel out. If you're new to the channel, please go and have a look at some of my other videos. I have everything playlisted, so if you want to look at some of my other anniversary album shows, I have a playlist for those. If you want to look at some of my studio albums ranked shows, I have a playlist for those. And if you want to see my appearances on other people's channels, I also have a playlist for those. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm at bicyclelegs on Instagram, Twitter, and many other places. I also have a dedicated bicyclelegs Facebook page. Links are all in the description. Please come and give those all a follow and join in the conversation. I'd really love to have you there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.